When the Reserve Bank announced recently that it was factoring climate change into interest rate calculations, it underlined a mainstream acceptance of potential impacts for a warming planet. Climate change now had economic consequences. But resistance to the premise of human-induced climate change still rages, including in regional and rural communities, which often are the very communities already feeling its effects. When you look at the results of different surveys going back a few years, farmers were 4 times more likely than the national average to be climate change deniers, said Professor Mark Howden, director at the RDNews Climate Change Institute. That was about 32% versus about 8% for the population average. So, why do so many people in regional and rural areas not believe in climate change? ABC Central West's Curious Project put that question to some experts, who say the answer has more to do with human nature than scientific reasoning. Cognitive scientists versus cognitive lawyers. Professor Matthew Hornsey from the University of Queensland has dedicated his academic career to understanding why people reject apparently reasonable messages. The metaphor that's used in my papers is around what we call cognitive scientists versus cognitive lawyers, he said. What we hope people do when they interpret science is that they weigh it up in an independent way and reach a conclusion. But in real life, people behave more like lawyers, where they have a particular outcome that they have in mind and then they selectively interpret the evidence in a way that prosecutes the outcome they want to reach. This is known as motivated reasoning, and online news source algorithms and social forums are only enabling the phenomenon, allowing for further information curation for the individual. Infographic: many people do not accept the climate science. ABC Rural, perception of threat and risk. Chris Evans grew up as the son of a farmer in Western Australia's wheat belt and went on to become a grain farmer himself. That is until 2004, when he walked off the farm and into a landmark research project of his own. His familiarization study sought to understand why climate science was being rejected by the WA farming community, and would later form a model of approach for government ag programs. The assumption that farmers would accept scientific information and acknowledge the need to adapt was something I questioned based on my own personal experience, Mr. Evans said. Yes, I had noticed changes in the climate over the time I had lived and farmed in the area, but I would have responded in a similar fashion to one of the farming participants I interviewed during the familiarization study. Of course it's changed. It's always changing. We have had big dries before back in the 1940s and 1970s, but then it turned wet again. To understand why farmers reject climate science, Mr. Evans says it must be acknowledged that humans don't interpret information in a vacuum. Rather, humans develop and harbor perception of threat/risk based on a framework of socio-cultural beliefs, values, history, traditions and knowledge. This is true for all assessment, scientific and non-scientific, he said. For example, WA farming and rural social sectors may have a low perception of threat/risk because of an inherent tolerance of climate threat/risk due to the high variability in the WA climate. Conversely, science and policymakers' perceptions of climate change threat/risk may be conceptualized in a different social framework of values and beliefs drawn from a broad view perspectives of evidence and potential impacts on a national and international scale. It is this disparity in sociocultural frameworks that can create a gulf of distrust between farmers, scientists and policymakers, bringing into question motivations and where the truth actually lies. Put simply, Mr. Evans describes it as the contested space between local knowledge and science. He says the way to overcome it is to apply the science at a local level, that is, contextualize the risk. Erosion of science credibility. Professor Hornsey says there is another force fanning the flames of distrust between the scientific and non-scientific communities. One thing that can be said without huge amounts of controversy is that there is a relationship between political conservatism and climate skepticism in Australia, he said. To better understand this, the professor's research took him to 27 countries and found that for 2/3 of these, there was no relationship between being politically conservative and a climate science skeptic. But Australia's relationship between the two trailed only the United States in strength of connection, he said. Photo: Matthew Hornsey believes some people reject the science on ideological grounds. Supplied, UK Business School. What we were seeing was the greater the per capita carbon emissions of a country, the greater that relationship between climate skepticism and conservatism. Professor Hornsey argues that per capita carbon emissions is an indicator for fossil fuel reliance, which in turn creates greater stakes for the vested interests at play. When the stakes are high and the vested interests from the fossil fuel community are enormous, you see funded campaigns of misinformation, coaching conservatives what to think about climate change, he said. Professor Hornsey points to the work of American historian Naomi Oreskes, who co-authored Merchants of Doubt, which asserts that campaigns of misinformation were tools used by vested interests as a means of controlling the narrative. The ultimate impact of sustained misinformation around Australia's climate science has been the erosion of scientific credibility and the illusion that scientists are in disagreement, he said. The science is in. 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are contributing to global warming, Professor Hornsey said. But most people feel as though that number is much lower and that there's quite a lot of diversity of opinion around this in the science community. This is not true, but that's the success of these campaigns of misinformation. Wicked problem in socioeconomic terms. A wicked problem is defined as one that is difficult or even impossible to solve, given the amount of cross-current and interrelated processes and resources required to resolve it. The drug trade, human trafficking and climate change are all classic wicked problems. Professor Hornsey believes current discourse can make farmers feel as though they are at the center of an overwhelming societal problem, triggering further psychological rejection of the science. I feel sorry for farmers around the climate change issue, because this is a problem that has been caused collectively. They feel like they are constantly being lectured about their need to make sacrifices to adapt to a set of circumstances that are largely out of their control. Don't talk about climate change in 2010. In response to a drought policy review panel, the Commonwealth initiated a pilot of drought reform measures in Western Australia. John Noonan from Curtin University led the program, which went on to have staggering success in converting not only participating farmers' attitudes to climate science, but also in restructuring their farm management models in response to a changing climate. First of all, when talking with farmers, we didn't call it the drought pilot, we used the name Farm Resilience Program, Mr. Noonan said. We got the farmers to have conversations about changing rainfall patterns and continuing dry spells, rather than us telling them what to do. And they told us everything that we needed them to tell us for us to reflect that back to them and say, well, actually, that's climate change. If you take a very left-brain, very scientific approach to these matters, you are going nowhere, and what we used was very right-brain, very heart and gut-driven, and it worked. Mr. Evans agrees, underscoring the deeply personal connection farmers have to the land, its role in their business approach, and why the message must be managed psychologically rather than scientifically. Ultimately, for a farmer to confront the reality that this new climate might be permanent, requires them to go through the 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. While you're here, are you feeling curious? Underscore more stories from New South Wales.